Okay, so welcome to the 2021 Canaltown Virtual Book Fest. I am Mallory, a librarian at Dover Public Library, and on behalf of the Canaltown Book Fest Committee, I would like to acknowledge our sponsors and thank them for helping make this event possible. All right, so our sponsors were Dover Public Library, the Bibliophile Bookstore, the Tuscarawas County Literacy Coalition, the Canaltown Dover Association, and the Canaltown Book Festival. So the topic of this panel is called Increasing Inclusion in Literature. And we are happy to have three experienced authors, Peggy Earhart, Navin March, and Carrie EB Black, who will be sharing their insights and backgrounds with us today. But before we begin, here are some housekeeping announcements. Participants who are viewing, just make sure your audio and video is off. It should just keep your microphone on red and your video on red, and I can go through and make sure everybody's off. So, yep. All right, so everybody's audio and video should be off unless they are presenter. All right, great. So a couple things to know. You'll be able to ask your questions in the chat. And if you look on your options, there should be a chat bubble, and you can click on that to chat. All right. So at any time during the presentation, you can ask your questions, but we'll hold them till the end. At the very end of all the presentations, I will read the questions. The presenters will have time to answer your questions, and that's how we're going to do it, okay? So each of the three authors will have 10 minutes to speak on today's topic. Peggy Earhart will go first, followed by Navin March, and then Carrie EB Black. And lastly, this panel is being recorded. So the presenters and the speakers are being recorded, so this can be shared at a later time on Facebook, okay? All right, so our first presenter is Peggy Earhart. Peggy Earhart is a former English professor with a doctorate in medieval literature. She published 2 music-themed mysteries with 5-star books and currently writes the Knit and Nibble Mysteries series for Kensington. The 7th book in the series, Nitty Gritty Murder, appeared in April. Her amateur sleuth, Pamela Patterson, is the founder of the Knit and Nibble Knitting Club, and Peggy herself is a devoted crafter, dating from her membership in 4-H as a child in Southern California. Go ahead, Peggy. Peggy, you're on mute. Peggy.
How's that? No, it's fixed.
They can't.
Yeah, it's working. She's got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. As Mallory said, my sleuth is Pamela Patterson, founder of a knitting club. She's an amateur sleuth in a charming small New Jersey town like the town I live in. Like me, she is a white woman. But with my background as a college English professor and a student of literature, I not only write mysteries, but I enjoy studying the mystery form. And from my historical studies in the evolution of mystery, I know that in terms of inclusion, the form has evolved a very long way since its inception. At the beginning, the form was anything but inclusive. Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue, published in 1841, is considered the earliest example of the mystery genre. Poe was a white American male, and his sleuth was a white male, however, a French aristocrat, because Poe set that story in Paris. Some decades later, Arthur Conan Doyle, a white British male, created his world famous sleuth Sherlock Holmes, also a white British male. What about Agatha Christie and Miss Marple, you might ask? Well, Miss Marple made her first appearance in a 1927 short story, The Tuesday Night Club. But Christie's male detective, Hercule Poirot, was introduced nearly a decade earlier in The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And note that Miss Marple is an amateur detective, a person without any special training in crime solving, but who has a knack for recognizing clues and identifying evildoers. Well, Poirot is a police officer who became a private investigator. So there's a lot of gender stereotyping going on there. Agatha Christie ushered in the period known as the golden age of detective fiction. And that was between World War I and World War II in England, primarily. And it gave us writers like G.K. Chesterton, Georgette Heyer, Josephine Tay, Dorothy Sayers, and many, many others. They were all white people whose sleuths resembled their creators. It wasn't until about 30 years ago that the genre began to welcome writers who weren't white and sleuths who didn't conform to very narrow stereotypes. That is, women sleuths were usually amateurs, while males could be professional sleuths, police detectives or private investigators. And almost all the sleuths were white. Before then, a writer like Chester Himes, an African-American, who in 1957 launched his series featuring the Harlem sleuths Rave Digger Jones and Coffin Ed Johnson, was very much the exception. But in 1990, Walter Mosley, an African-American, introduced Easy Rollins, a Harlem detective in Devil in a Blue Dress. That was his first that launched his series. In 1992, the African-American Barbara Neely, who just died last year and had a nice obituary in the New York Times, launched a series featuring amateur sleuth Blanche White, whose name obviously is quite witty, since Blanche is an African-American, and she's a house cleaner, an amateur sleuth who's going into people's houses and cleaning in their most intimate spaces. Certainly gives her a chance to recognize clues and piece things together. African-American Valerie Wilson Wesley created her sleuth Tamara Hale in 1994 for a series set in Newark, New Jersey. Since then, the list of African-American mystery novelists has grown and grown. And there's a wonderful online reference for anyone who wants to get a fuller picture. It's a website called StopYourKillingMe.com. It's all one word with no apostrophe in your, but if you want to find it, you can just search on Stop Your Killing Me and the URL will come up. It lists hundreds of mystery writers alphabetically with links to their websites. And most usefully, it has a feature that lets a person search on, for example, diversity. And within diversity, African American or Asian American or Native American or gay and lesbian, many, many other categories. And one can also search geographically to find all the mysteries set in New Jersey, for example, of which there are quite a few, and probably in Ohio as well. And you can search on subgenres. If you like gritty mysteries, you can search on hard-boiled. If you like cozy mysteries like mine, you could search on cozy or traditional. So it's an incredible, incredible resource, and the people who created it are absolutely heroic. So Asian American writers and sleuths are now well represented too in the mystery field. I'll just mention a few writers I'm personally familiar with because I've heard them speak or I've met them at writers' conferences. There are many, many more than these. Naomi Hirahira based her sleuth Mas Arai, a Japanese American gardener in Los Angeles, on her father. Sujata Massey's ethnic heritage is Indian, but her sleuth, Rei Shuamura, is Japanese, though she's since launched the second series featuring an Indian woman, Harveen Mistry. Laura Jo Rowland's heritage is Chinese and Korean, but her mysteries are set in 17th century Japan. Henry Chang is the creator of Detective Jack Yu, whose beat is New York City's Chinatown. Many series that feature non-white sleuths are published by Soho Press, which is a small press based in New York City. For the past few decades, it has limited its mystery offerings to books set in countries other than the United States and written by writers deeply immersed in the cultures they write about. The Soho instructions to authors specifically say we don't want a travelogue. We want a book that's really living in this culture. So, for example, they published the work of Colin Cotterill, who I heard speak when a bookstore was hosting a book launch for a friend of mine and accidentally scheduled two authors' events in the same night. So I hadn't expected to meet or know anything about Colin Cotterill, but that was how I became acquainted with his work. He's British, but he lives in Thailand, and his sleuth is Dr. Siri Paibu, a coroner in the People's Republic of Laos, who is also a shaman. And Cotterill really understands this culture completely and does a wonderful job treating what the adventures of a coroner in this particular society would be. Inclusion also includes sleuths who are not straight. For all we know, Sherlock Holmes was gay, but he wasn't out of the closet. Modern mysteries featuring gay or lesbian sleuths present that aspect of a character as naturally as a writer might deal with a straight character's marriage or love affairs. Sandra Scopatone, for example, created Lauren Lorano, a lesbian private investigator based in Manhattan in 1991. And in 1993, Laurie King introduced the lesbian homicide detective Kate Martinelli based in San Francisco. There are many others, and you can find them at Stop You're Killing Me. The journey is not over. Sisters in Crime, a international organization of women crime writers, though it also welcomes men, still crusades for women writers to attain the same sales figures and recognition as male writers. And until recently, most of the nominees for the Mystery Writers of America Edward Awards were books by men. Thank you.
All right, so thank you, Peggy. That was a really informative discussion about mystery and inclusion. So our next author to speak is Navin March. Navin March is the first Indian-born author to win Minotaur Books Mystery Writers of America Award for Best First Crime Fiction. Her debut novel, Murder in Old Bombay, is nominated for Edgar, Anthony, Barry, and Hammett Awards this year. An active member of Mystery Writers of America, she has appeared on NPR and been featured in Mystery Tribune, Mystery Scene Magazine, Crime Reads, Book Page, The History Reader, and other publications. Murder in Old Bombay was selected as Amazon Editor's Pick and reviewed as a New York Times Best of 2020 crime novel. I read that article. After 20 years in business analysis, she returned to her passion of writing fiction and now teaches creative writing at Rutgers Osher Institute of Farsi Zoroastrian herself. Nev lives in New Jersey with her husband and two sons. Sorry if I mispronounced anything.
Thank you, Mallory. Thanks so much. Yeah, you got it all right. Thank you. And I'm so happy to be here. And thank you to Mallory and the Canal Town writers and the Dover Library for inviting us. Thank you also to Peggy. That was a marvelous setup. So I'm going to skip the part where I talk about, there have been a bunch of really good white male writers for centuries. A writer meant a white male. And it's only in the 1800s where you start to see Austen and Jane Austen and the Brontes, and you start to get more female writers. But it's actually only till much later that you start to see women of color or more diverse characters show up. So I'm not going to talk a little bit about Asian literature, about South Asia, Pearl S. Buck, a white woman that introduced the world to China. You had a few writers that introduced the world to India. Kipling, Rudyard Kipling did a marvelous job. E.M. Forrester's Passage to India is marvelous. And then you had a little later, you've got John Masters and MMK, all of whom I read and devoured growing up. But you know what? They're all white. They're writing about India, writing about my culture, and many of them were very, very fond of India and the Indian environment and the Indian people. But I had started reading Tagore, Bapsi Sidhwa, Arundhati Roy, Vikram Seth, and other Indian writers, and I realized that the perspective is vastly different. It is major a contradiction sometimes. The same situation is seen as romantic from the colonial ruler's perspective, and is seen as oppressive from the colonized people's perspective. My own book is Murder in Old Bombay, is set in 1891, which was still during the period when India was colonized. India was colonized by Britain until 1947, when it got independence, which is fairly recent. So I'm writing during a period of the Raj, the British Raj, and I found that I was uniquely situated to give a balanced perspective. I belong to a Parsi, Zoroastrian is a religion, Parsi is a community that were loyalists. We loved the British Raj, but we were also native. So we saw the oppression and the discrimination and the exclusion that went on during that time. So my character, Jim Agnihotri, Captain Jim Agnihotri, is an Anglo-Indian. And by the way, it's not just white people who didn't like a mixing of the races. The Indians didn't like it either. So racism went both ways. And this is a heritage that we've had, had to deal with. Coming back to Indian writers, I started to get exposed to a lot of interesting and beautiful writing from Jhumpa Lahiri, for example, and other writers, Bapsi Sidhwa, marvelous writer, and realized that that I could do it, that I wanted to do it. And I think that's part of being a writer of color or writing ethnic characters, is you have to want to do it and feel that you can and own it. And it's astonishing to me now to know that for a long time, I felt like somehow, because I know 3 other languages, that I was supposed to write in my mother tongue, and that if I wrote in English, people would see me as somehow something of an usurper. And it took me a while to get around that idea and say, no, however we got English, whether it's through colonial expansion or whatever, we now have it, we own it, we have a right to write in it. And so once I got over that hurdle, I think I felt free to start creating. And it's interesting, even then, that I gravitated towards historical fiction and only later to crime fiction, even though my novel is historical, it's a historical mystery. So genre literature, I feel in some ways, is maybe a little bit behind some of the more traditional or literary fiction, which went the route of inclusion a little bit earlier. There are some marvelous writers writing today, taking not just the perspective of the diverse, the minority groups, but folks, whatever their ethnicity and their upbringing, are trying to represent the minority groups, and to do that in a tasteful and empathetic way, not as local color, not as furniture, not as the token Black friend in the story, but as the main character. And I think that if a white writer wants to write a diverse character, as long as they have sensitivity readers or someone that knows that culture and can represent it, that is fine, that's okay. unfortunately, through history, diverse characters have been the villain. I mean, think of Injun Joe, right? From Tom Sawyer. Think of one of my most favorite books, Jane Eyre. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre has the woman in the attic is, a diverse character. She's also labeled mad and therefore shut away. And this goes back to how women have been silenced for centuries. If you were an outspoken woman in medieval Europe and many other parts of the country, you were burned, you were ritually murdered. And that was okay. That was what the community did. Nice community, right? But it was normal for the time. In the next 2 centuries, it was normal for outspoken women to be shut away in asylums if they got unpleasant to deal with. So you were, quote unquote, mad and shut away. And therefore, women have been silenced. But we're starting to find our voice. It is, though, something that we should pay attention to, and the fact that it is all very recent. It's only since the mid-1900s, I would say, that you have a lot more women writers, and only since the 1990s, maybe, that you have a lot more Asian writers. And even then, the representation is minuscule. We have now modern writers. Sujata Massey was mentioned, and I have to show you that her latest, the third in her series, the book will be launching on June 9th. So look out for that. Love the series, Permanent Mysteries of Marvelous Sleuth, based upon a real female lawyer, 2 female lawyers actually in India at the time. Abir Mukherjee writes a marvelous series. These are some of his, and he's based in England, and he has a white character, but situated in India at the time during the colonial Raj, and a male character, but a marvelous empathetic point of view. And the Watson is a Bengali guy. So happy to see his continuation of the series. Sometimes Asian writers and Indian writers and diverse writers, it takes a long time to break out. I know Amy Tan's Joy Luck Club took 10 years before it actually broke out. But I do know also that David Wyden has a marvelous indigenous Native American sleuth action hero, if there ever was one, and his book has just been optioned for a series. So really excited to see that. G.T. Pandian is another marvelous writer for young adults who writes fantasy and sources from Indian mythology. So why should we welcome diverse books? Why? Well, number one, they're interesting stories. They are fun stories. They also broaden people's perspective. And so, throughout the 1900s, you've got the male cop detective exploring and finding the injustice in the world and trying to bring justice to victims and families. Now you have a lot more opportunity. The way that writers represent the character is frequently how powerful or powerless the attitudes, the belief of the reader becomes. So we have to change the narrative of the diverse characters as being traumatized victims, weaker somehow, and that they pull from our sympathy and our pity and create characters that are powerful, empathetic, but still inventive, creative, and able to act. And so I love this TV series called Lupin, Lupin, which has a Black character in Paris that is an absolute marvel to watch. So I do want to point out that when we write about characters and cultures that we do not personally know, that it's an obligation to research it thoroughly, but also to reach out to writers that do have that experience. And therefore, I'm going to recommend Crime Writers of Color is a marvelous resource. You can reach out, get email addresses, and I have personally been happy to be sensitivity reader for a couple of writers that want to write about India. Lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about my book because the character is very much South Asian, but he's Anglo-Indian, and his name itself is a contradiction. And there's the clue right there. Race is going to be a key factor in the book. However, it's a murder mystery. It's an action adventure. It is a love story. And I'll show you a couple of pictures just to round out this talk. If I have a couple more minutes here. Sharing the screen right now. My story is based upon a real event, an unsolved mystery to date. In 1891, these two ladies on the right were sisters-in-law, and they plunged to death from the top of the Rajabai Tower in Bombay. It's now called Mumbai. This was a photograph, a portrait painted at the time, and this is what I thought one of the victims would look like. This mystery was never solved. It was assumed to be suicide, but the two women were privileged. They were both married, they were happy, and they didn't die at the same time. And this has become a wound in our community's consciousness. So I centered my mystery on the deaths of these two women. And to solve the mystery, I came across this character. It's a representation from Pinterest. I'm not sure who this guy is, but it's the expression on his face that struck me. And I created this character that is intrinsically empathetic, but also has his own wounds and his own problems to deal with. And so because he is multiracial, he's biracial, which is really at that point in time a huge disadvantage in society. He's really not included. And I wanted to point out the pain that that causes. Of course, he ends up using his biracial ancestry to solve the crime. He can dress the part. He knows the manners of the Brits. And he also speaks multiple languages. And so he can explore India. So read the book if you want to get a travelogue and enjoy India without leaving your couch, because India is very much a character in the book. By making an Indian Asian character central to the plot, not the British detective, not the British administrators, not the policemen, I switched the narrative, the narrative somewhat. All the main characters in the book are Indian. And yes, there are some Indian words. There's also a glossary for you if you need it. Enjoy the book, and I hope that this helps bring more inclusion into the genre of novels. And I'm so pleased that Mystery Writers of America chose this novel as their as the award winner for the Minotaur Award in 2019.
All right, thank you, Nev. That was really interesting. I'm definitely going to request your book to read, because that, oh my gosh, that mystery of what happened to those women just sounds so great. I mean, not great for them, but great for the story. All right, so our last presenter is Carrie EB Black. Carrie EB Black believes in the value of every voice and hopes to allow the stories of even the quietest among us to shine. She joins this panel with the unfortunate knowledge that it only takes a simple fall to cause a person to become handicapped. She is the proud mom of an amazing young lady who struggles with and overcomes the challenges of several brain-related birth disorders. And Carrie's husband found a trip to work interrupted by a head-on collision, which resulted in several new physical challenges. Thus, Carrie spends a great deal of her time advocating for inclusion and increasing awareness. Carrie lives in a suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is a heavily grandfathered and thereby not handicap-friendly city. Okay, yay, Carrie.
Thank you for having me. It's a tough act to follow you two ladies. Indeed, I come from Pittsburgh, which is an old city, and a lot of Pittsburgh is what's called grandfathered, which means that if it's a building that was built before a certain time, they are not obligated to make it handicapped accessible, which makes it a little bit of a challenge. Now, any new building, new construction, that sort of thing, they do include on ramps, that sort of thing. But even just getting over a little hurdle, like a bump in the sidewalk, can be a challenge if you have a wheelchair, or even if you have a stroller, if you have a little kid in a stroller. Anyway, I'm here because I think any discussion about diversity should also discuss inclusion. Inclusion, of course, meaning people of varying abilities. There are so many, so many people in this world who have disabilities you might not even notice. As of 2019, the World Health Organization says that there are 2 billion people worldwide, which is basically 1 in 7 worldwide. Somebody who suffers with a disability. In the United States alone, as of 2019, I couldn't find more updated information. There are 61 million adults, that's not including the children, who have a disability of some sort. And that's 26% of our population. That's pretty amazing. And yet, when you read literature, a lot of times you don't see the disabled people. I will say this, well, we'll get to that in a minute. The disabilities, there are obvious disabilities, wheelchairs, you know, a white cane, a service animal, crutches, but there are a lot of hidden disabilities. Somebody might have epilepsy. They might have a traumatic brain disorder. There's autism, there's diabetes, MHMR, cystic fibrosis, all sorts of things. And then there's things like psychiatric disorders, bipolar, I think PTSD, anxiety, that would be under that. And in literature, a lot of times you don't notice the disabled person as much. Nev, you were mentioning a lot of times a person who is different is often made the evil person, the villain, the antagonist. And that sometimes happens in literature too, with a disabled person. Madness is often equated to being evil. Just so you know, I personally write a lot of young adult and middle grade literature. And so I read a lot of young adult and middle grade literature, but I also write a lot of horror, and I read a lot of horror. So I was going to talk real quick about somebody who probably everybody has heard of. His name is Stephen King. He has a long and lush literary career, and he has, from the very beginning, done his, I think, his best to try and include differently abled people, and sometimes with varied success. Another thing that Nev mentioned, which is really important, is sensitivity readers. A lot of times, somebody might have a real enthusiasm for something, but if they haven't personally experienced it, it's very easy to, instead of include, appropriate, and we don't want appropriation. Stephen King, in The Stand, which is one of my favorite books, has a character who is mentally disabled. And his famous line was M-O-O-N, that spells moon. And he made his way to the big apocalyptic ending in The Stand. Another of Mr. King's books was The Silver Bullet. One of the most wonderful and charming things about The Silver Bullet is the lead character is in a wheelchair that he calls the Silver Bullet, and hence the name. And it's a werewolf story. And this young man ends up, this protagonist in a wheelchair, ends up being the hero. Then we come to a more modern book that Mr. King called Mr. Mercedes. Mr. Mercedes has a young woman in it who has autism. This young woman is probably, I think, if I remember correctly, she's in her 30s. And she starts out, and you can tell that she has autism, but it's not intrusive. By the end of the story, somehow or another, she deteriorated. I don't know. She became like a 3-year-old. She was running around clapping her hands and repeating words. And I remember reading that as a mom of a young person who has autism, thinking this isn't the best example that we can have for this sort of thing. Now, along the lines of young people, again, I have young people and I write for young people. And there in literature recently has been a wonderful influx of people who have disabilities in literature. For instance, Bridget Kemmer's young adult, The Curse, Dark and Lovely, has a lead character who has cerebral palsy. I was thrilled to read that to my little girl because she has cerebral palsy. We also read, oh my goodness, Marissa Meyer's Cinder, which has a disabled person who ends up overcoming it with tech. It's kind of cool. When I was a young person, the only time I remember seeing somebody that I could look up to who was in a wheelchair or obviously disabled were in comics. I remember Professor X from the X-Men, and I remember Daredevil, who Professor X was in a wheelchair and Daredevil was blind. And it was kind of wonderful to see somebody empowered and not downtrodden by their disability. Some other wonderful examples of some younger literature that have disabled characters, leads, include Palacio's Wonder and Sharon M. Draper's Out of My Mind. Whitney Gardner's Your Welcome Universe is charming, and that young lady is a Black woman. And then there's, I cannot pronounce the name, but the last name is Khan, and it's King for a Day. It's lovely to see more inclusion, but I think everybody wants to be able to read a book and see themselves represented in a positive way. And I think that is the biggest complaint that has hitherto been, is that when somebody who is differently abled was represented, it was usually not in the most positive way, or it was in a supportive sidekick kind of manner. They were never the lead. They didn't have agency. Whereas it's nice, and it would be important to continue to see people have agency and be represented. And that's really what I had to say.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Like, your insights on the topic of disabled people being represented in literature is so important and so easily overlooked. So we have some time to answer questions. You can type your questions in the chat. There should be a chat bubble on your screen or hidden in your menu. You can ask it to a specific author or to any of the authors, and I will read those off and they will answer them. All right, so let's see what questions we have so far. All right, Carol Showing wanted to know if Peggy Earhart could provide the links you mentioned in your talk. Yeah, you had a lot of good things that people might want to follow up on. I don't know if you'd be willing to like make a post about that I could share to the Facebook page, and that way people can see what you were talking about. All right, Donald Firesmith. Also authors, you can unmute yourselves if you would like. Donald Firesmith asks if you guys have any advice on writing first person of a character that is of a different gender, ethnicity, etc. For example, I read about a dozen books with strong female protagonists by female authors before I wrote the 2 books in my Hellhole series written in first person point of view with female protagonists. All right, so do you guys have writing advice?
Sure, absolutely. So my character is a 30-year-old male recovering soldier, okay? I'm obviously none of those things. But the trick is that initially when the book went out, the advanced review copies went out to a few readers, my photograph wasn't on it. And the vast majority of them thought I was male. So I did something right. And I think it's about really empathizing with a certain point of view. I did have a number of men in my critique group who routinely pointed out a guy wouldn't say that. Okay, there are subtle ways that language is used differently by men and women. And I know we want to give, girls and boys equal opportunity and, give everybody agency, but these are subtle wiring. And I think you need to accept that and empathize and be in that skin, whatever sex it happens to be. Alexander McCall Smith, okay, has this whole series where he's talking in the voice of an African woman, and he's utterly believable. And he's got the rhythms of the place, and you can hear her. So it can be done. You do need to empathize, but you do also want your sensitivity readers and readers of that gender, whatever your facet of your character you do not have, make sure you find someone who has that facet and reads it and pay attention to what they say.
Yeah, one example of that, very silly. I had written something and one of the male readers looked at it and said, "No man calls a restroom a powder room."
Oh God.
Things like that. Yes. Thank you, Carrie.
Peggy, you're still on mute. Thank you.
Hi. I have something to weigh in with. Well, actually, 2 things. The person who asked about the link, and I tried to answer, but I didn't realize I was on mute. Yes, I would be happy to provide a link to Stop You're Killing Me and also some references to Soho Press, and I will send them to you, Mallory. And then
All right.
you can, and I'll do that as soon as we finish up here. And the first mystery I ever wrote had a young man protagonist, and I wrote it in the first person. It did not get published. Men who read it said he was the most unrealistic man they had ever encountered, and women who read it said they just loved him. So it's like, obviously I was creating the woman's version of the ideal man there.
Of course, yeah. All right, so let's see what the next question is. Oh, we have some really positive comments. Elaine Dubach said that Nev's book sounds fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, I have a question from Deborah Edmiston. She says, I am a white writer about to release a Victorian era mystery that takes place in a Downton Abbey type setting. One of the main characters is Indian and also wheelchair bound. I deal with the discrimination he faces from the English aristocracy because of his disability and ethnicity. This character also points out during the course of the story, the English people would also face discrimination from his people. In general, do you find that readers are receptive to the very direct handling of the topic of discrimination in a fiction narrative?
I think, have I frozen?
Yeah, sorry, who's on?
Oh, Carrie, go ahead. I think, yeah, you were frozen for a moment, but you're good now.
Okay. One thing I will say is going to sound absolutely ridiculous, but if you are yourself disabled, a lot of times you're visible. It sounds absurd, but I cannot tell you how many times my daughter has been completely overlooked. She will be standing beside me with her little wedges and her service dog, and somebody will say to me, "Can I have a dog?" I'm like, "That is her dog. You could ask her," you know. So a lot of times a person who has a disability is completely ignored. I don't know if it is because it is difficult to look at and worry, well, this could happen to anybody at any time, or what, there, but by the grace of God go I. But for some reason, people who are disabled are often ignored. As to Victorian society, they had a very, very negative vision of what a disabled person was. And actually, if you look at the things that were available for a disabled person, a lot of times they were very, even the wheelchairs were fairly sedentary. And a lot of times a person who was disabled was considered somehow shameful, and people would hide them away, just like in Jane Eyre. Hopefully not as severely, but that would be my input.
Yeah, I can contribute a little bit. Victorian Society, they did understand a little bit about genetics, right? But that actually went against anyone who had either a different race or disability or any weakness, actually, because people would hide away in a shame, ashamed of their relative or family member who had that weakness or that disability or that facet, just, that particular facet of themselves, because of the fear that somehow it was contagious, that the children would be contaminated, that they were not marriageable. And this is actually at the root for many societies. This is at the root of why mental illness is not treated. It's not even acknowledged, because if you acknowledge it, it's real. And it's rather, the denial comes from trying to pretend that it is not real and it's not there. And today, no one would consider a broken arm a shameful thing, right? Physical illness, yeah, you go get treated, and mental illness should be treated the same way. Unfortunately, that's not the history in most cultures.
I'll be honest too. The idea of, for instance, disability being a convenience item, that actually does persist. I remember when my little girl first went to Brownie Scouts, so they were at 5 and 6 year olds. They had to make a big circle, a big friendship circle at the end, and the little girls wouldn't hold my daughter's hands because they thought that they would catch cerebral palsy. And I took the leaders aside, because to me, if somebody is staring, that's one of the two reactions. Either a person ignores or they stare. If a person is staring, I take that as an opportunity to enlighten and educate. What I did at that point was took the leaders aside and I said, "Hey, can I come in without my daughter being here and we could talk to the kids?" And a lot of the parents would not allow it. All I wanted to do was show them some of her equipment and let them know what was involved with cerebral palsy, and that it was not contagious. You could not catch it. And only 4 girls showed up from a troop of 20 to hear about this.
I think in a reader that there's a certain, because they're following the story, and they've suspended disbelief to some extent to follow that story, that there is a certain acceptance if you address issues, if you address discrimination, if you address this kind of attitude that people have that Carrie just described, the resistance, really, if you put that in a book, people will see truth and you can get a message across. I want to believe better in a book than in trying to persuade someone. When you say something, there's an automatic reaction where people want to find reasons why they can oppose or contradict you. It's just the natural way that people behave. But when you persuade in a story, if they truly empathize, I believe that attitudes can shift.
All right. So we have another question, a very specific one from Carol Schoenig. It says, I'm writing a story that involves a woman with a prosthetic leg. She is shot in her prosthetic leg, and I'm having trouble researching what would happen. Does the leg shatter? Does she feel pain? Any suggestions on how to research these kind of disabilities?
I would contact somebody who makes prosthetics. Locally here in Pittsburgh, we have Union Orthotics and we have Delatories. They're both wonderful. We've used, my daughter and I've used both. I have 3 friends who have prosthetic appliances, and it depends on the kind of prosthetic that the person's wearing at the time. If it's metal, it's not going to shatter. If it's the polyfiber, they do tend to break. I don't know if it would actually shatter. It might, a bullet might go through it. As far as feeling pain, you would feel the jolt in wherever it's attached. And that is very sensitive. I remember my one friend telling me, my toes are itchy, but she didn't have any toes. So, but yeah, in the area where it's attached, you definitely would feel it.
All right. Does anyone have any more questions to add to the chat? Yeah. All right. Okay, well, that's about our time. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining our the importance of inclusion in literature. I know I'm a librarian and I work with children a lot. So when I see a kid who's like, hey, this book has me in it, like they're so excited. So if you're a writer and if you're looking to promote characters of different abilities, different ethnicities, different genders and beliefs, like think about how you can positively and sensitively incorporate them into your stories. That way, some kid or some adult can be like, hey, this book understands me and gets what I'm about. So we'd like to thank Peggy Earhart and Navin March and Carrie EB Black for their insights on this topic. You guys are so informative and I'm looking forward to reading your books. So our next panel is going to start at 11:30 and it's going to be about the basics of writing a book. So you'll learn a lot in that panel. It's going to be very interesting and informative. So please check that out. In between panels, you can go to the Facebook page. You can check out the giveaways that are posted on there, and you can enter those giveaways. There's some interesting questions we've had about the giveaways. You need to go to the original post to join the giveaways. So click on the image that's shared. It will take you to the original post. Follow the instructions the author has shared, and you can join a giveaway that way. So we appreciate you all for being here and learning about this topic. So thank you.
Thank you for coming, and thank you, Mallory, for having us.
Yes, thank you. It was wonderful.
Thanks, Mallory. Thanks, Dover Library.